Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Close your eyes for a moment. Picture the night sky. Not the washed-out grey haze you see from a city, but a truly dark sky, the kind you only find hours from civilization, where there is no light pollution, no artificial glow, nothing between you and the raw cosmos. The stars are numberless. The Milky Way stretches overhead like a river of pale light. It is immense, overwhelming, and beautiful. And for a few seconds, it is easy to feel small beneath it. Now imagine something living out there. Something that has been crossing the dark spaces between galaxies for so long that human civilizations have risen and collapsed like waves on a shore before it even noticed we existed. Something so vast and so ancient that it does not see individual planets. It sees feeding grounds. It does not experience curiosity, or wonder, or malice. It only experiences hunger. A hunger so deep and so absolute that it has driven it to consume world after world, system after system, galaxy after galaxy, for longer than anyone in the Milky Way has the capacity to truly understand. And then one day, completely by accident, a single device on a single planet in a corner of a single galaxy lit up like a candle in the void, and those ancient, ravenous eyes turned toward us. Welcome back. If you are here for the first time, this is Q on 40K, the channel where we explore the lore of Warhammer 40,000 with long, detailed, atmospheric deep dives. The kind of video you put on when the world is quiet and you just want to sink into something extraordinary. Today we are asking one of the most fascinating and genuinely unsettling questions in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. Not just who the Tyranids are, though we will absolutely cover that in full. Not just which hive fleets have invaded, though we will walk through each one with the depth they deserve. The real question, the one that keeps Ordo Xeno's inquisitors from sleeping, is why they are here. What brought something from beyond the borders of our galaxy to our corner of the cosmos? Was it inevitable? Was it a terrible accident? Was it the fault of people who had no idea what they were doing? And most haunting of all, is what we have faced so far really the full scale of the threat? Or are we only seeing the very first outstretched fingers of something incomprehensibly enormous? The answers are layered, rich with detail, and in some ways more terrifying than anything a surface-level reading of Tyranid lore would suggest. So settle in, pour something warm, and let us begin at the beginning, which is to say in the cold, lightless dark between the stars. What are the Tyranids? Before we can properly understand why the Tyranids have come to the Milky Way galaxy, it helps to fully appreciate what they actually are, because the Tyranids are genuinely unlike anything else that exists in the setting. Every other faction in Warhammer 40,000, no matter how alien or bizarre they might seem on the surface, operates according to principles a human mind can at least partially grasp. The Orcs fight because fighting is their culture and their instinct, something woven into their very genetics. The forces of chaos are driven by emotion, by ambition, by corruption, by the desire to please gods who are themselves born from mortal feeling. The Aldari are ancient and cold, but they still have grief, they still have pride, they still have the capacity for something that functions like love. Even the Necrons, who wake from billions of years of mechanical sleep and immediately begin reasserting their dominance over all living things, are at least driven by recognizable goals: survival, power, the reclamation of a stolen existence. The Tyranids are different. They are not driven by emotion or ideology or culture or ambition. They exist for one reason and one reason only, and that reason is hunger, pure absolute, biological hunger. The kind that operates not as a feeling but as a directive hardwired into every cell of every organism across an entire species. Everything they do, every creature they birth, every world they strip clean, every genetic innovation they engineer across 1,000 consecutive generations, all of it is in service of the same imperative: feed, survive, evolve, repeat, repeat without end, across the void forever. To understand how this functions in practice, you need to understand the hive mind. The hive mind is the collective psychic consciousness of the entire Tyranid species. It is not a single individual, not a brain in a jar, not a god in the conventional sense. It is something more like a vast, living network, a psychic gestalt that connects every Tyranid creature in every hive fleet across every galaxy it has ever touched. When you look at a single Tyranid organism, say a Hormagaunt, one of the quick, skittering predatory creatures built for speed and close quarters killing, you are not really looking at an individual. You are looking at a single cell in a body that contains trillions upon trillions of cells. The Hormigaunt has no name, it has no wants of its own, it has no dreams. It is an expression of the hive mind's will, given form and purpose by the hive mind's endless need. This psychic connectivity is maintained across vast distances through what the Imperium calls the synapse network. Within a hive fleet, larger and more cognitively complex Tyranid organisms, hive tyrants, zoanthropes, Tyranid warriors, act as psychic hubs, relaying the will of the hive mind to the lesser creatures around them. The smaller organisms, your termagants and hormigaunts and rippers, do not actually require complex individual brains. They are kept coherent by the network. When that network breaks down, when a synapse creature is killed and the lesser organisms are cut off from the hive mind, those smaller creatures can become erratic, animalistic, reverting to feral behavior. But even that is temporary. The hive mind has countless redundancies. The network reconfigures. Another synapse creature moves into position, and the swarm continues. Now, the hive mind maintains this psychic connectivity without actually using the warp in the way that other psychic species do. This is deeply strange to the scholars of the Imperium, and they cannot fully explain it. Normally, any sufficiently powerful psychic presence interacting with the warp attracts the attention of chaos, drawing daemons like predators drawn to the scent of blood. A single powerful psyker surrounded by daemonic beings is a constant reality in the 41st millennium. An entire species of trillions of psychically connected organisms should be an absolute catastrophe, a beacon so bright it would draw the entirety of the warp's most ravenous entities down upon it, and yet it does not. The hive mind is utterly immune to daemonic corruption. Chaos cannot tempt something that has no individual ego, no personal desires, no ambition to exploit. The daemons of chaos reach into the Tyranid swarm and find nothing to grab hold of. An observation so chilling that one imperial text simply noted that where a human soul might burn like a candle to the inhabitants of the warp, a Tyranid organism leaves a cold void in place of a soul entirely. The ships that carry the hive fleets are themselves living organisms, grown rather than built, assembled from the same biological raw materials that feed everything else in the swarm. There is no steel in a Tyranid fleet, no circuits, no combustion engines. A hive ship is a creature, immense beyond human comprehension, capable of surviving in the vacuum of space, capable of birthing and launching thousands of smaller organisms in the same way a body produces and deploys immune cells. The fleet is not a navy. It is a living ecosystem suspended in space, with every element from the smallest spore to the largest hive ship functioning as part of a single integrated organism. And that organism feeds. When a hive fleet descends upon a world, the process it undertakes is not simply military conquest, it is digestion. The planet's oceans are evaporated and absorbed. Its atmosphere is stripped away layer by layer. Every living thing from the tallest sentient being to the smallest underground microbe is consumed, broken down, and turned into the raw biological slurry from which new Tyranid creatures will be grown. Capillary towers, immense biological structures grown by Tyranid organisms during the assault, pump this nutrient, rich biological matter up from the planet's surface into the waiting hive ships in orbit, where it is funneled into the massive chambers of the Norn Queens. The Norn Queens are perhaps the most important organisms in any hive fleet, even though they are almost never seen in battle. They are the biological engineers of the swarm, colossal creatures that exist at the heart of the largest hive ships, surrounded by protective layers of the deadliest organisms the fleet can produce. A Norn Queen takes in the raw genetic material of everything the fleet has consumed, every alien species, every creature, every plant, and uses genetic shredder organs to pull apart its DNA and add it to what is essentially a living gene bank of millions of genotypes. When the hive mind identifies a threat that existing bioforms cannot adequately counter, the Norn Queen pulls relevant genetic templates from this archive and splices them together to create something new. Something specifically engineered to solve that problem. And then that innovation is shared instantly through the psychic network to every other Norn Queen across the entire fleet, so that within a remarkably short time, every ship in the hive fleet is producing the new improved bioform. This means that fighting the Tyranids is a fundamentally different kind of challenge from fighting any other enemy. When you fight chaos, you learn their tricks, you build your defenses, and those defenses remain valid the next time. When you fight the Tyranids, every victory is also, in a sense, a defeat. Every tactic you use to overcome them is immediately catalogued, analyzed, and countered. The fleet that attacks you next time will have already engineered solutions to whatever strategies destroyed its predecessor. In one famous account, a Tor commander who had developed a highly effective weapon system to counter a specific strain of Tyranid organism watched with helpless horror as, within a matter of weeks, the Tyranids simply stopped producing that strain and began deploying a new one that was completely immune to her weapon. The war, for the Tyranids, is not a series of separate engagements. It is a continuous learning process, and they are relentlessly, mercilessly, brilliantly good at learning. All of this, every starship, every warrior, every drop of digested biomass, every genetic innovation, feeds back into the single overriding directive: more biomass, more fleet, more hunger. It is a loop without a terminal condition, a biological machine that perpetuates itself by consuming everything around it, and in consuming, grows large enough to consume even more. Understanding this helps understand why the Tyranids do not stop at one galaxy. Why would they? A galaxy is just a very large feeding ground. Once consumed, the hive mind does what it has always done. It looks toward the dark spaces between the light, and it searches for the next meal. The cold between galaxies here is a thought that does not get nearly enough attention in casual Warhammer 40,000 discussions. The Tyranids are not from this galaxy. Not the way the Necrons emerged from within the galaxy after their ancient sleep. Not the way orcs exist everywhere, because their fungal spores have spread to practically every planetary body with a compatible climate. The Tyranids came from outside. They crossed the intergalactic void, those vast, incomprehensible stretches of near, absolute nothing that separate the Milky Way from its neighbors, in what astronomers call the local group. The distances involved are so extreme that describing them in light years almost loses meaning. The gap between the Milky Way and the Andromeda Galaxy, for instance, is roughly 2.5 million light years. That is not a distance you cross easily, or quickly, or without cost. And yet the Tyranids did it, multiple times, from multiple directions. Because here is one of the most quietly terrifying pieces of information in all of Tyranid lore. The hive fleets that have invaded the Milky Way did not all come from the same place. Hive Fleet Behemoth arrived from the eastern fringe of the galaxy. Hive Fleet Kraken came from a slightly different direction, also from the eastern approaches but at a different angle, as though it had traveled a separate path. Hive Fleet Leviathan arrived from beneath the plane of the galaxy entirely, striking from a perpendicular direction that the Imperium had never even considered defending. Multiple hive fleets, multiple angles of approach, multiple intergalactic void crossings. Which suggests, and this is where Ordo Xenos scholars lose sleep, that the Tyranids have been occupying and consuming the surrounding galaxies of the local group for so long and so thoroughly, that entire separate portions of the species are now converging on the Milky Way from the directions of different galactic neighbors. The current collection of hive fleets that have invaded this galaxy are not a single coordinated force that set out from one departure point. They are fragments of a species so enormous that it has spread across multiple galaxies simultaneously, and those fragments are now all orienting toward the same new target. If that is true, think about what it means for the galaxies those fragments came from. The Andromeda Galaxy, which is the most notable large galaxy in our local group, contains something in the region of 1 trillion stars, roughly 10 times the mass of the Milky Way. If portions of the Tyranid species came from there, if the angles of approach suggest that Andromeda or something in that direction was one of the Tyranids' previous feeding grounds, then Andromeda may already be empty. 1 trillion stars worth of inhabited worlds stripped clean. Civilizations that perhaps rose to space, faring capability billions of years before humanity even existed on Terra, consumed, absorbed, incorporated into the hive mind's ever-expanding genetic archive. And what about those civilizations? This is a thought that the lore gestures toward without ever fully spelling out. The Tyranids do not merely kill, they absorb. Every species they consume they learn from. Every defense mechanism, every predatory adaptation, every biological innovation from the life forms of 1 trillion worlds is now encoded somewhere in the hive mind's genetic memory. The creatures facing you in the Milky Way today are not just Tyranids. They are Tyranids plus every species they have ever consumed. Their claws may contain adaptations from predatory creatures that evolved on worlds in Andromeda. Their carapaces may incorporate biological armor solutions developed by insectoid species that lived and died before humanity was born. The swarm that crashes against your defenses is, in a very literal sense, a distillation of billions of years of galactic biodiversity, focused entirely into killing and consumption. The void crossing itself is a feat that should perhaps be impossible, or at least impossibly difficult, for anything biological. Space between galaxies is not simply cold and dark. It is almost incomprehensibly empty, even by the standards of intergalactic space, which is itself extremely sparse. The gravitational maps that Hive ships use to navigate, a process facilitated by specialized organisms called narvals, which detect and manipulate the gravitational influences of distant stars to create corridors of compressed space, would be nearly useless in the intergalactic void, where there are no stars close enough to provide the gravitational anchors the fleet needs. The crossing must have been done in something close to hibernation, the fleet drifting through the dark in a state of metabolic suspension, the hive mind itself perhaps quieter than it has ever been, its hunger still burning but its urgency dormant, waiting for the moment when the first dim gravitational signatures of a new galaxy began to make themselves felt at the edge of perception. In this context, the question of what finally woke them up, what specifically directed their attention toward the Milky Way, rather than any other destination, is not a minor detail. It is one of the most consequential events in the history of the galaxy. And the answer, it turns out, involves a device most people have never heard of, a sacrifice by a man whose name is barely remembered even by the chapter that reveres him, and a chain of consequences so vast that nearly 10,000 years later, the galaxy is still paying for it. The device that ended everything, the Pharaohs and the Battle of Sotha. The story begins, as so many stories in Warhammer 40,000 do, during the Horus Heresy. This is the cataclysm that defined everything that came after. The moment when Horus Lupercal, the greatest of the Emperor's gene sons, turned against his father and plunged the young Imperium of man into a civil war so devastating that 10,000 years later, its scars still shape the galaxy. During this period, vast swaths of the Milky Way were cut off from one another by warp storms, communication was impossible, and individual commanders had to make desperate decisions with incomplete information and no reliable way to coordinate with their allies. One of those commanders was Robout Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, master of a region of space called Ultramar. Cut off from Terra by a catastrophic warp storm called the Ruin Storm, Guilliman could not know whether the Emperor lived or whether Terra had fallen. What he could do was hold his territory, and he did. He created what he called the Imperium Secundus, a secondary Imperium in miniature, centered on Macragge, designed to maintain human civilization and continue the Emperor's work even if the worst had happened and Terra was truly lost. To maintain cohesion across this emergency Imperium, Guilliman needed a way to communicate. He needed a beacon, something that loyal forces scattered by the warp storm could navigate toward. And he found one, on a planet called Sotha, inside a mountain called Mount Pharos. The device that the Ultramarines and their allies discovered inside that mountain was not human. It was not Eldar. It was, as later scholarship would eventually determine, Necron in origin, a quantum empathic resonance beacon, built by the galaxy's oldest and most technologically sophisticated civilizations before they went into their long sleep. The Pharos, as it came to be called, worked on principles entirely unlike warp-based navigation, where the Astronomicon, the psychic lighthouse maintained by the Emperor from his golden throne on Terra, cast its light through the immaterium and required navigators with psychic sensitivity to perceive it. The Pharos operated in real space, manipulating something closer to the empathic resonance of consciousness itself. It could not penetrate the Ruin Storm's interference the way the Astronomicon could not. But it was a light, a signal, a point of reference for scattered loyalist forces to home in on. Guilliman used it, and it worked. Loyalist elements across the region were drawn towards Sotha, toward the beacon, and the Imperium Secundus began to function. But this drew attention from the wrong places. The Night Lords, one of the traitor legions, warriors of darkness and terror who had made cruelty into a religion, identified the beacon and recognized what it meant. If they could control the Pharaohs, they could control the movement of loyalist forces across the entire region. They launched an invasion of Sotha, and what followed was the Battle of Sotha, one of the smaller but more consequential engagements of the entire heresy. At the heart of that battle was a man named Barabbas Dantioch. Dantioch was a warsmith of the Iron Warriors Legion, the engineers, the siege specialists, the breakers of fortifications, and he was one of the few Iron Warriors to remain loyal to the Emperor when his Primarch Perturabo threw his lot in with Horus. Dantioch had come to Sotha, had been instrumental in exploring and operating the Pharaohs, and had formed a deep bond with Captain Alexis Pollux of the Imperial Fists, one of the most determined loyalists of the heresy. When the Night Lords descended on Sotha in overwhelming numbers, it fell to Dantioch to make a choice. He could not stop the Night Lords conventionally. There were too many of them. But he could end the battle another way. By overloading the Pharaohs, flooding it with more psychic energy than it was designed to contain. He could devastate the Night Lords' forces above the planet and on its surface, turning their own power against them, blinding their ships and disabling their power armor with a tsunami of empathic energy. It would almost certainly kill him. It did kill him. But it saved Sotha, saved the Pharaohs from falling into enemy hands, and preserved Guilliman's ability to continue functioning as a rallying point for the loyalist cause. Dantioch overloaded the Pharaohs. The device discharged an enormous burst of psychic energy, far beyond anything it was designed to project. The Night Lords were shattered. The battle was won. Dantioch's sacrifice was honored. And eventually the scythes of the Emperor Chapter, descendants of the loyalists who had defended Sotha, would bear crossed scythes as their emblem in memory of what happened in those tunnels under Mount Pharos. And out in the intergalactic void, millions of light years away, something stirred. The burst of psychic energy from the overloaded Pharaohs did not simply dissipate within the Sotha system. It propagated outward, rippling through space like a shockwave, carrying the signature of the device's unique, empathic resonance across distances that should have made it undetectable in any meaningful way. But the advanced scouts of the Tyranid hive fleets, organisms drifting in the cold dark between galaxies, in something like a hibernating state, attuned to exactly the kind of psychic signals that might indicate a galaxy rich in biological life, detected it, and they were interested. The signal said there is life here. There are psychic organisms here. There is energy here. There is something worth approaching, worth waking up for, worth crossing the dark for. The hive mind turned its attention toward the Milky Way. It would take nearly 10,000 standard years for the hive fleets to traverse the distances involved and begin their first probing incursions into the galaxy. 10,000 years of slow, patient, terrible purpose. 10,000 years of the Milky Way living its history. The end of the heresy, the scoring of the traitors, the long twilight of the High Imperium, the age of apostasy, the Nova Terra Interregnum, all of it, entirely unaware that something impossibly old and impossibly hungry had turned to look at it. The inhabitants of the galaxy went about their wars and their politics and their worship and their survival with no idea that a timer had started. That somewhere out in the dark, drawn by a single moment of heroic sacrifice, the great Devourer was coming. There is a special kind of tragedy in that. Dantioch died saving people he cared about, in service of a cause he believed in, performing an act of tactical genius that preserved the Imperium Secundus and by extension helped ensure the ultimate loyalist victory in the heresy. And in doing so, he inadvertently rang a dinner bell that would take 10 millennia to reach the ears of what it summoned. Nobody knew, nobody could have known. There was no malice in it, no foolishness, no preventable error. Just the terrible, mechanical indifference of consequence. An act of heroism became the catalyst for the greatest threat the galaxy has ever faced, simply because the universe is large, and it is old, and things that drift in its dark spaces are patient beyond the capacity of mortal minds to comprehend. Guilliman, for his part, ordered the Pharaohs sealed and destroyed after the heresy ended. Thousands of tons of xenotech were removed from Mount Pharos, and its tunnels were filled with ferrocrete. An officer named Obadiah was appointed warden of Sotha, and a company of ultramarines was permanently stationed there to guard the buried secrets. That duty eventually passed to the Scythers of the Emperor, Chapter after the third founding, who set up Sotha as their homeworld and maintained their vigil for centuries, unaware of the precise nature of what they were guarding against. And then, in 993 of the 41st Millennium, a tendril of Hive Fleet Kraken arrived at Sotha. The Scythers of the Emperor fought with everything they had. They were nearly annihilated. The homeworld they had kept for centuries was consumed, stripped to rock by the very force that the Pharaohs had unknowingly drawn. The chapter survived, barely, scattered across the galaxy, their numbers reduced to levels that would take generations to rebuild. It is a grim footnote, a story of beautiful and painful circularity. The beacon that drew the Tyranids to the galaxy was buried under the homeworld of the chapter that guarded it. And when the Tyranids finally arrived in that system, They consumed the Guardians and the Secret alike. The Astronomicon, a lighthouse for the hungry. The Pharaohs may have been the original signal that drew the Tyranids' attention to the Milky Way. But it is not the only beacon that has guided them since. There is another, larger, brighter light burning at the heart of the galaxy, and the Tyranids can feel it. They have been feeling it since they first turned their course toward the Milky Way, growing stronger with every decade of travel, until by the time Hive fleet behemoth crashed into the eastern fringe in 745 of the 41st millennium, the Hive mind had been locked onto its source for thousands of years. The Astronomicon is one of the most extraordinary and terrible things in the Imperium of man, located on Terra. Focused through the bodies of several thousand psychers who burn through their life force at a terrifying rate in the process of maintaining it, the Astronomicon is a psychic beacon of almost incomprehensible power. Its light penetrates the warp and can be perceived by trained navigators across distances of up to 50,000 light years, giving them a fixed reference point through which to safely navigate warp space. Without the Astronomicon, the Imperium of man essentially collapses. Warp travel becomes immeasurably more dangerous. Interstellar communication becomes nearly impossible, and the logistical bonds that hold a million worlds together begin to fray and snap. The Astronomicon is, in the most literal sense, what makes the Imperium of man function as a single entity rather than as millions of isolated, frightened worlds. And it is powered by the Emperor of mankind. Wounded beyond healing at the Battle of Terra, the Emperor exists in a state that is neither life nor death, imprisoned in the Golden Throne, a life support system of extraordinary complexity that keeps the fragile spark of his consciousness burning. In death, or in whatever state he currently occupies, the Emperor is still the most powerful psychic being in human history. His presence burns in the warp like a star, and that light, channeled through the Astronomicon, shines outward across the galaxy with a brilliance that can be perceived not just by navigators in the warp, but by anything with sufficient psychic sensitivity operating even at vast interstellar distances. The Tyranid hive mind has that sensitivity many times over. The hive mind is itself an entity of extraordinary psychic mass, a consciousness that manifests in the warp in ways that the Imperium still does not fully understand, and the Astronomicon, blazing from Terra with the full force of the Emperor's dying light, is visible to it, not as a navigation aid, not as a landmark, as a source, as the signal that tells the hive mind here is something alive, something psychically rich, something worth crossing the dark for. Here is the center of it all. This creates an implication that is almost too disturbing to fully dwell on. The Emperor, in his selfless sacrifice to preserve humanity and maintain the light that guides every navigator, every ship, every cargo fleet and military convoy and pilgrim transport in the Imperium. The Emperor, in doing this most essential and heroic thing, is also the reason the Tyranids are so specifically directed toward the core of the galaxy. Toward Terra, they are not wandering randomly. They are not consuming indiscriminately in all directions. Each major hive fleet that has entered the galaxy has moved with a broad orientation toward the galactic center, toward the Astronomicon, toward the Emperor. The scale of that irony is profound, and the Imperium has largely chosen not to examine it too closely. The knowledge that their greatest protector's presence is also what guides the greatest threat in history directly toward humanity's heart is the kind of information that, if widely known, might shake the faith of billions. So it is known to a very small number of very senior officials in the Inquisition and the Administratum, recorded in sealed archives, discussed only in the most secure chambers, and the Astronomicon continues to burn. Because the alternative, letting it go dark, letting the Emperor die completely, would destroy the Imperium far more certainly than any hive fleet ever could. There is something philosophically fascinating about this. The Imperium of man is sustained by a beacon that simultaneously marks it as the most significant target in the galaxy. Every ship that safely navigates the warp, every world that receives its supply of food and ammunition and replacement troops and preachers and bureaucrats, every mechanism by which the Imperium continues to function, all of it is made possible by a light that says, in the language of the stars, here we are. We are here, and we are alive, and we are worth coming for. And the Great Devourer agrees. Some scholars within the Ordo Xenos have speculated about what might happen if the Emperor were to die completely, if the Astronomicon were to go dark. Their conclusions are not comfortable. On one hand, the Tyranids might lose their primary beacon, might scatter without that central point of orientation, might become less directed. On the other hand, the warp catastrophe that would follow the Emperor's true death. The opening of a psychic wound in the galaxy so vast it would make the Eye of Terror look like a scratch, would likely be far more immediately destructive than any hive fleet. The Imperium of Man cannot win by letting the light go out. It can only survive by keeping it burning and fighting with everything it has. What makes the Astronomican's role particularly poignant is the relationship between it and the Pharaohs. The Pharaohs drew the Tyranids' attention first. That is the canonical first cause. The moment the hive fleets oriented toward the Milky Way, but the Pharaohs was a small signal, a candle. The Astronomican is an inferno, once the advancing fleets were close enough to detect it. Once their leading scout organisms and Genestealer vanguards began operating in the Milky Way, and the hive mind was receiving psychic feedback from within the galaxy itself, the Astronomican became the dominant beacon. The Pharaohs may have turned their heads. The Astronomican is what has kept them coming. The vanguard, Genestealers, and the art of patient infiltration, one of the things that makes the Tyranids so uniquely terrifying as a threat. Beyond their sheer biological power and their capacity for accelerated evolution is the sophistication of their preparation. They do not simply arrive at a galaxy and begin consuming. They send advanced scouts ahead of the main fleet, infiltrators designed to penetrate inhabited worlds, assess their defenses, weaken their social structures, and ultimately serve as psychic beacons that draw the fleet to the most biomass-rich targets. These vanguard organisms are called Genestealers, and understanding them is essential to understanding the full horror of what the Tyranid invasion actually means for every inhabited world in the Milky Way. A Genestealer, in its pure strain form, is a six-limbed predatory organism built for speed, stealth, and close-quarters killing. Two of its limbs end in hands that can grip and manipulate. The other four end in long, blade-like claws capable of shearing through ceramite, the same material that makes up Space Marine power armor. It is fast enough to close distance on a fully armored Space Marine before he can properly respond. It can survive in vacuum. It has an enhanced sensory suit that makes it extraordinarily difficult to ambush. Individually, a single Genestealer is a match for almost anything short of a trained Astartes. In a group, they are devastating. But the really terrifying thing about Genestealers is not their killing ability. It is what they do before they kill. A lone Genestealer, having stowed away on a freighter and found its way to an inhabited world, does not immediately start slaughtering everything in sight. Instead, it hides. It seeks out isolated individuals, a maintenance worker in a sub-basement, a wanderer on the outskirts of a settlement, a lonely figure in a dark place where no one will notice a disappearance. It approaches them, and through its tongue, using an organ the Imperium calls the ovipositor, it implants a packet of its own genetic material into its victim. The victim does not die. Instead, they experience something that might be described as an awakening. Their mind is subtly altered, their loyalty rewired in ways they are completely unaware of. They become devoted to the creature that infected them, and to the growing extended family of infected individuals that the Genestealer accumulates over time. When they reproduce, their children will be Genestealer hybrids, part human, part Genestealer, showing physical features that mark them as changed, but not always dramatically different enough to draw immediate suspicion. Over generations, this cult grows. First-generation hybrids show obvious Tyranid traits, extra limbs, alien features, grotesque physiognomy that makes them almost impossible to pass in normal society. They hide in the underbelly of the world, in sewers and tunnels and abandoned places. Second- and third-generation hybrids look more human, enough to hold jobs, form families, participate in society while hiding their nature. Fourth-generation hybrids can pass as entirely normal, indistinguishable from baseline humans, except to the most careful medical examination. And fifth-generation reverts. The cycle's children produce pure Genestealers again, restarting the genetic loop. Throughout this multi-generational infiltration, the cult slowly and methodically works its way into positions of power. Port officials who are actually cult members allow cargo ships to pass uninspected, potentially carrying Genestealer spores to new worlds. Planetary Defense Force officers who belong to the cult begin sabotaging defensive preparations in subtle ways. Delayed equipment requests here, misfiled personnel assignments there, nothing individually suspicious, but cumulatively damaging. Civic leaders who are infected guide political decisions toward outcomes that serve the coming invasion. The world is being hollowed out from within, its defenses being quietly dismantled. its leadership being gradually replaced with creatures who believe they are awaiting the arrival of transcendent beings they call the Star Children. Messengers from beyond the stars who will bring them to a higher existence. They are wrong, of course. The Star Children are not messengers of transcendence. They are the hive fleet, arriving to devour everything, including the faithful cultists who prepared the way for them. This is perhaps the most quietly heartbreaking aspect of Genestealer cult lore. The cultists genuinely believe in what they are doing. They believe in the redemptive arrival of the Star Children. They have built a religion around this belief, filled with genuine devotion and community, and the kind of profound certainty that makes people willing to die for their faith. When the day of ascension comes, and the cult finally rises in open rebellion against the world's government and military, they are fighting with the complete conviction that they are hastening a beautiful thing. And then the fleet arrives, and the patriarch, the original Genestealer, now immense with absorbed genetic material and psychic power, the living heart of the cult, simply abandons its children. It rejoins the hive fleet. The psychic bond that held the cult together is severed, and the cultists, many of whom have never known anything but devotion to a cause they believed was holy, realize in their final moments that they were always just preparation. They were the tools that softened the meal. The brood mind of a Genestealer cult serves as a psychic beacon even before the fleet arrives. As the cult grows in size and the number of psychically connected hybrid organisms increases, the combined psychic signature of the entire congregation becomes detectable across interstellar distances. When a hive fleet is within a few hundred light years of an infected world, this signal triggers something in the cult, a subliminal acceleration, a frenzy of preparation and breeding and political maneuvering, as the hive mind begins to exert its pull. The day of ascension is not chosen by the cult's leadership. It is compelled by an external force the cultists experience as divine calling. What makes this especially unnerving is the timeline involved. A Genestealer infestation can run for generations before it becomes detectable. A single Genestealer arriving on a world in the 38th millennium might plant the seeds of a cult that does not reach its full devastating potential until the 41st. Worlds that the Imperium considers loyal and stable might contain cult populations that have been growing quietly for centuries, waiting for a signal that their worshippers will hear as the voice of their gods. The Imperium does not have a reliable way to detect active infestations until they are already dangerously advanced. The Ordo Xenos devotes enormous resources to hunting Genestealer cults, specifically because of how catastrophically underestimated the problem consistently proves to be. And every Genestealer infestation is ultimately connected to the hive mind. The Genestealers themselves may operate with a degree of independence. They are notoriously the most individualistic Tyranid organisms, capable of pursuing their own propagation agenda, even without direct hive mind oversight. But the psychic beacon they generate is always accessible to the fleet. Every world that a Genestealer has reached and infected is a potential landing site, a flagged target in the hive mind's vast and patient awareness. The galaxy has been seeded for longer than the Imperium knows, in more places than the Ordo Xenos has yet discovered, with organisms patiently building the infrastructure of their own world's doom. The lore is fairly clear that Genestealers were already present in the Milky Way well before Hive Fleet Behemoth made official contact in 745, M141. They were encountered as early as the 35th millennium on the moons of Ymgal, and at the time were thought to be an entirely separate species of alien predator. It was only later, through agonizing investigation by the Ordo Xenos, that the truth was established. Genestealers are not indigenous to the Milky Way. They were introduced, whether by deliberate seeding by advanced biological scouts or by some other mechanism, ahead of the main hive fleets. The galaxy had already been infiltrated long before anyone realized there was anything to be infiltrated against. 3 waves of annihilation. The Tyrannic Wars, the actual physical arrival of the Tyranid hive fleets in the Milky Way, occurred in stages, with each new fleet representing a different approach, a different strategy, and a different level of threat than the one before it.
Okay, I want to step out of the lore for just a second because I genuinely think about this stuff way too much and I need to share it with someone. The Pharaohs thing, that detail specifically, it lives in my head rent-free. Like Barabbas, the Antioch gave his life to save his brothers. He does the single most heroic thing imaginable, and the ripple from that one moment of sacrifice crosses literal intergalactic space and essentially signs humanity's death warrant 10,000 years later. This is such a gut punch when you really sit with it. No villain plotted it, no chaos god engineered it. It was just a good man doing the right thing at the worst possible cosmic moment. And that honestly is what makes 40K so different from everything else for me. Tragedy isn't evil. It's the good intentions. But anyway, I also want to apologize for the audio quality today. I'm running into some rendering problems. I'm going to get that fixed very soon. And let's get back to the video.
These events are collectively referred to as the Tyrannic Wars, and they are among the most significant military conflicts in the history of the 41st millennium. Understanding each one reveals not just the scale of the invasion, but the terrifying intelligence behind it, the way each subsequent fleet demonstrated that the hive mind had not merely attacked, but learned. The first and most famous of these is the arrival of Hive Fleet Behemoth. The year in the Imperial calendar was 745 M41, and the location was the eastern fringe of the galaxy, the outermost edge of Segmentum Ultima. A world called Tyranids was the first to fall, a small, relatively isolated research station of the Adeptus Mechanicus, home to a few thousand biological humans and servitors, positioned at the very rim of explored Imperial space. It was a planet that barely anyone outside its immediate stellar neighborhood had reason to think about. Until it went silent. The silence was noticed by an inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos named Fidus Cryptman, a man who would go on to become one of the most consequential and controversial figures in the history of the Tyrannic Wars. Cryptman dispatched a vessel to investigate, and what his representatives found when they arrived at Tyran Primus was a world stripped down to bedrock. Not merely devastated, not merely conquered, consumed. The oceans were gone, the atmosphere was thin and rancid. Every living thing from the largest animal to the smallest organism had been removed, dissolved, incorporated. The planet was a husk, as though something had reached down from space and simply eaten it. In the wreckage, one of the Mechanicus adepts who had accompanied Cryptman's investigation discovered a data codex hidden 3,000 meters underground, lowered into a bore shaft by a Magos named Varnak in his final hours as the invasion reached its climax. Varnak had gathered every observation he could about the attackers, recorded everything he witnessed, and hidden this record in the hope that someone would eventually find it. That someone turned out to be Cryptman, and the data within the codex was humanity's first detailed look at the horror it now faced. Following the trail of devastated worlds left by the Hive fleet's passage, Cryptman slowly, with growing horror, mapped the fleet's course. It was not random, it was direct. It was moving through the eastern fringe on a course that pointed at Macraige, the homeworld of the Ultramarines and the most significant military and cultural center in the region. Behemoth was not meandering. It was heading for something. Whether it was specifically targeting Macraige because of the Ultramarines' presence, the hive mind recognizing it as a major source of biomass and military resistance to be overcome, or whether it was simply following the navigational pull of the Astronomicon and Macraige happened to be in the way. The result was the same. The full weight of Hive Fleet Behemoth was coming for the heart of Ultramar. What followed is called the Battle of Macraige, one of the most brutal and celebrated engagements in Space Marine history. The Ultramarines were decimated. Multiple worlds in the path of the fleet were simply destroyed, their populations consumed before any meaningful defense could be organized. Prandium, a paradise world of extraordinary beauty that had been settled for centuries, was stripped bare in a matter of weeks. The fleet arrived at Macraige with a momentum built on countless consumed worlds, its Norn queens having had months to process the biomass of everything they had eaten into new, improved bioforms. The scale of the swarm that descended on Macraige was something the Ultramarines had never trained for, never modeled, never considered possible. And then it got worse. Late in the defense, the hive mind deployed something new, the Swarmlord, a unique bioform. A pinnacle synapse creature that represented the hive mind's most direct and active engagement with tactical reality, appeared in the planetary assault and immediately began transforming the battle. Where before the Tyranids had charged with the mindless ferocity of starving organisms, now they moved with intelligence. They avoided zones of heavy fire, attacking flanks instead of fronts. They concentrated pressure on the specific weak points in the Ultramarine line, the gaps that Tyranids earlier in the battle had identified, and the Ultramarines had not yet fully reinforced. The Swarm Lord personally engaged Chapter Master Marnius Calgar and came terrifyingly close to killing him, leaving Calgar with injuries so severe he required extensive bionics and months of recovery. The battle was eventually won, at enormous cost, through a desperate act of sacrifice by the Imperial Navy. The battleship Dominus Astra, an Emperor-class vessel, plunged into the heart of the Tyranid fleet in orbit and detonated its warp drives in a cataclysmic explosion that annihilated the core of Behemoth's space forces. Without the fleet, the organisms on the ground were isolated, cut off from the hive mind's deepest strategic direction, and eventually hunted down and destroyed. But the cost was staggering. 2 entire companies of Ultramarines were killed to the last man in the polar defense positions on Macragge, fighting until their ammunition was exhausted, and then fighting with their bare hands against organisms that literally could not stop coming. It took the chapter centuries to replace those losses. Hive Fleet Behemoth was broken, but not destroyed. Its splinter fleet scattered and continued to plague the eastern fringe for decades, consuming smaller, less defended worlds and slowly rebuilding their numbers. And the hive mind was not discouraged. It had probed the galaxy's defenses, discovered the shape of its resistance, and observed how its forces had been defeated. This information was filed away, processed, incorporated. The second great invasion came sooner than anyone expected. Hive Fleet Kraken arrived in 993, M41, less than 250 years after Behemoth, and it was immediately apparent that the hive mind had learned from its first experience. Where Behemoth had moved as a single, coherent mass, charging directly at the strongest point of resistance, Kraken fragmented. It approached as dozens of separate tendrils, spreading across a wide front, striking at multiple systems simultaneously, pushing the Imperium to defend everywhere at once when it could only be strong in one place. This was not the charge of a mindless predator. This was something much more frightening. This was strategy. The scale of the Second Tyrannic War was larger than anything the Imperium had faced before. Whole sectors fell silent. The elder craftworld Eandon, one of the oldest and most populated of the surviving craftworlds, home to hundreds of thousands of Eldari, faced a tendril of Kraken so enormous that the entire population mobilized for war. Every civilian became a soldier. The dead were called back to animate the Wraithguard, massive constructs of wraithbone piloted by the souls of the deceased, because the living were not enough to hold the line. Eandon was very nearly destroyed. It was saved, ultimately, only by the timely arrival of the exiled Corsair Prince Ryle with his pirate fleet, whose intervention broke the back of the Kraken assault on the craftworld. But the Eldari paid a terrible price. More of Eandon's population dwells in the Infinity Circuit, the ghostly afterlife contained within the craftworld's wraithbone structure, than walks its corridors in living flesh. It is a civilization that survived, but only barely, and the wounds from that battle define what Eandon is today. On the Imperial side, the campaign came to its decisive moment at Echery V, where Marnius Calgar, recovered from his wounds, armed with hard, learned knowledge of Tyranid biology and tactics, led a defense that successfully shattered the primary body of Hive Fleet Kraken. The Ultramarines had learned, just as the Hive Mind had. New anti-Tyranid doctrines developed between the First and Second Tyrannic Wars proved their worth. Kraken was broken, though like Behemoth before it, splinter fleets scattered into the galaxy and continued to cause devastation for decades afterward. Some of those splinters are still active. The third and most alarming invasion was Hive Fleet Leviathan, arriving in 997, M41. What made Leviathan so disturbing was not simply its size, though it was significantly larger than anything that had come before. It was the direction. Every previous Hive fleet had come from the eastern fringe, from roughly the same approach vector, in the region of space from which the Pharaoh's signal and later the growing Astronomicon had guided them. Leviathan came from beneath, from below the galactic plane, in a direction that had literally never been considered as a threat vector, attacking from a three-dimensional angle that made all of the Imperium's carefully developed defensive perimeters suddenly irrelevant. 2 massive tendrils, hundreds of light years apart, curved up through the galactic plane like the closing jaws of some unimaginable predator, threatening to trap enormous sections of Imperial territory between them. Entire subsectors found themselves cut off before they even understood they were under attack. The scale of the shadow in the warp cast by Leviathan was unprecedented, Psychers and navigators across a vast swath of the galaxy reported the onset of symptoms, the crushing psychic static, the bleeding eyes and broken minds that came with proximity to a hive fleet of Leviathan's magnitude. Inquisitor Kryptman, still active and still fighting, implemented what became known as the Kryptman Census, burning out dozens of astropaths in a desperate attempt to contact worlds across the entire southern fringe of the Imperium. Slowly, from the map of silences and responses, a picture emerged, and what it showed was so terrible that Kryptman took an action that would effectively end his career and his standing in the Inquisition. He ordered the exterminatus of dozens of Imperial worlds in Leviathan's path, destroying them before the fleet could consume them, denying the hive mind the biomass it needed to sustain and grow its forces. It was ruthless beyond anything in the Inquisition's long history of ruthlessness. Billions of loyal Imperial citizens were killed at Kryptman's command, not as punishment and not even as strategic deterrence, but simply as denial of resources to the enemy. Entire populations were destroyed to deny the Tyranids the calories they needed to keep coming. Whether it worked or not remains a matter of contested scholarship. The hive fleet was eventually broken at multiple engagements, including the brutal defense of Baal by the Blood Angels chapter and their successors, who faced Leviathan's largest tendril at their homeworld and held on by their fingernails until the opening of the Great Rift intervened in ways nobody had anticipated. Kryptman was stripped of his rank and cast out of the Inquisition by his peers for the enormity of what he had done. But those worlds were still gone, and Leviathan was not destroyed. Its tendrils were broken, scattered, reduced, but the genetic material of everything it had consumed, everything it had learned, was already incorporated. Splinter fleets of Leviathan are still active across the galaxy, and the main body of the fleet, its core intelligence, its Norn queens, its deepest reserves, is believed to still be out there, beyond the current fringe of the invasion, waiting. The shadow in the warp, to understand what it feels like to face the Tyranids as an individual, as a world, as a civilization, you need to understand the shadow in the warp. The warp is the psychic dimension that underlies real space in Warhammer 40,000. It is the source of all psychic power. It is the medium through which astropaths send messages, through which navigators guide ships on faster than light journeys between the stars, through which daemons intrude into the material world, through which the chaos gods extend their influence across the galaxy. For any civilization that uses psychic power in any form, and the Imperium of man is utterly dependent on it, the warp is as essential as oxygen. The Astronomicon shines through it. Every astropathic message travels through it. Every navigator navigates it. When a Tyranid hive fleet approaches, it brings with it a phenomenon that is the hive mind's collective psychic mass pressing against the boundary between the warp and real space. The hive mind is an entity of enormous psychic weight, and the sum total of the psychic communication between the trillions of organisms in a hive fleet generates an effect in the warp that can only be described as a shadow, a region of psychic static so dense and oppressive that it drowns out all other signals, all other communications, all other connections. This is the shadow in the warp, and it is one of the most effective weapons the Tyranids possess, even though they do not choose to deploy it. It is simply a consequence of what they are. For a navigator on an Imperial ship, the shadow in the warp is like trying to see the Astronomicon through a storm. The beacon is there somewhere, but the noise is deafening, the static overwhelming. Navigation becomes exponentially more dangerous. Ships attempting warp travel in the proximity of a hive fleet risk getting lost in the immaterium, swept off course, or consumed by the predators that lurk within the warp itself. The shadow effectively cuts off any world or system it envelopes from warp-based travel or communication. Ships cannot leave. Distress calls cannot penetrate. Reinforcements, even if dispatched, cannot navigate to the target without extraordinary risk. For an astropath, one of the psychers trained to send and receive messages encoded in psychic energy, the shadow is worse. Astropaths work by projecting their consciousness into the warp to transmit, and by opening their minds to receive. The shadow fills both channels with noise. The Adeptus Mechanicus archives are filled with accounts of astropaths driven insane by the proximity of a hive fleet, their minds shattered by the sheer overwhelming weight of alien psychic static. There are reports of astropaths breaking their own skulls against bulkheads, trying to silence the chittering they could no longer block out. Of navigators going blind as their third eye, the organ through which they perceive the warp, was overwhelmed, and then simply burned out by sustained exposure to the shadow. The minds of psychers are instruments finely tuned to perceive very specific things, and the shadow is the equivalent of pressing those instruments against the loudest, most chaotic sound in existence. For ordinary humans, the shadow manifests more subtly but no less dangerously. A pervasive dread settles over populations in the proximity of an approaching fleet before any physical organism has even been detected. Sleep becomes troubled, nightmares intensify. The sense of being watched or stalked becomes a constant background anxiety that wears at psychological resilience. People who are already fearful become paralyzed. Communities that depend on collective will and mutual support find that will quietly bleeding away as the shadow makes every individual feel profoundly, inexplicably alone. By the time the spores fall and the killing begins, significant portions of a prey world's defenders are already psychologically compromised. This is not accidental. Whether the shadow is deliberately engineered by the hive mind or is simply a byproduct of the fleet's psychic mass is debated, but its tactical effect is clear. The shadow in the warp is a weapon that strikes before a single claw or bullet is deployed. It isolates, it silences, it terrifies. And it ensures that when the physical invasion begins, it begins against defenders who are already isolated, already afraid, and already unable to call for help. The shadow also has a specific effect on Eldar, the most psychically sensitive non-Tyranid species in the galaxy. For Eldari, who exist in a state of constant, refined psychic perception, who feel the echoes of others' emotions and experience reality in a broader sensory register than any other species, the shadow is not merely oppressive, it is agonizing. It can kill Eldar simply by its proximity, overwhelming their finely tuned psychic sensory apparatus the way a high-powered laser would overwhelm a human eye. This is one of the reasons the Eldar are so acutely aware of the Tyranid threat, why Craftworld Iandan nearly sacrificed itself rather than risk the survival of an enemy that specific Aldari foresight had identified as an existential threat. When you can feel the shadow coming, and you know what it means, there is no room for denial. The shadow also explains something that might otherwise seem puzzling about the Tyranid invasion from the Imperium's perspective. Worlds frequently go silent with no warning before any Tyranid organism has physically arrived. Communications just stop. Trade ships stop arriving and departing. And then, sometimes months later, the physical attack begins. By that point, the targeted world has been isolated for long enough that any response the Imperium might have organized is either far away, unable to navigate to the target through the shadow, or simply unaware of the scale of what is happening. The prey has been softened before the predator even shows its claws. What hasn't arrived yet, Tyana. And the deepening dark, one of the most unsettling realities of Tyranid lore, is the growing awareness within the Imperium that the hive fleets encountered so far are almost certainly not the main body of the invasion. They are the leading edge, the outstretched fingers of something whose full arm has not yet reached the galaxy. Consider the mathematics. Hive Fleet Leviathan was described at the time of its arrival as the largest Tyranid incursion ever encountered, substantially larger than anything before it, and even it proved to be a collection of tendrils rather than a unified whole. The true main body of Leviathan, the Norn Queens, the deepest reserves, the core intelligence, is still out there. And Leviathan is just one of a dozen or more identified hive fleets, each of which is a fragment of the larger species. The scholars of the Ordo Xenos have a grim saying, "What we have faced is the outrider swarms, not the swarm. Everything that has attacked the Milky Way so far has been, in geological terms, a preliminary probe. The reconnaissance in force ahead of the main event." Among the stranger and more troubling manifestations of the Tyranid presence in the galaxy is Hive Fleet Tiamat, a fleet that behaves unlike any other. First detected in the 35th millennium, 2,000 years before Behemoth arrived, Tiamat seems to have been a very early probe, possibly a biological seed deployed ahead of the main fleet to assess the galaxy's habitability and resources. Unlike every other hive fleet, Tiamat has not stripped the worlds it occupies. It has claimed them and then began building something on them. In the Tiamat system on the eastern fringe, a jungle world called Xyophoria has become the site of a continent, spanning biomechanical structure, a construction of chitin and pulsing flesh that grows larger with every decade. The Ordo Xenos has dispatched Deathwatch kill teams to investigate. Most have not returned. Those that did described a structure of such complexity and such overwhelming psychic intensity that even seasoned psychers experienced convulsions before the thing's raw emanations. What is it for? The leading theory among those with access to the classified reports is that it is a beacon, a psychic resonator, grown rather than built, designed to broadcast a signal of extraordinary power into the intergalactic void, calling someone, calling something. The exact nature of what it is calling, or from how far away, is not known. What is known is that the Tyranids defend Tiamat with a ferocity entirely disproportionate to the world's apparent strategic value, which suggests that whatever is being built, there is important enough to the hive mind that it cannot be allowed to be destroyed. A Deathwatch kill. Team that attempted to penetrate Xiophoria's defenses in detail reported that the organisms guarding the structure were behaving with an urgency and a coordination that suggested the hive mind was directing that defense personally, not through the usual layers of delegation. If the structure on Xiophoria is indeed a beacon calling for reinforcements from beyond the galaxy, summoning more of the main fleet, or signaling to other portions of the species still in the intergalactic void, then the invasion that has been occurring over the last few centuries of the 41st millennium is prologue, an advertisement, a signal flare saying the prey is here, and it is rich, and the way is prepared. After the Great Rift tore the galaxy in half, a new complication arose that the hive mind had to adapt to with characteristic cold efficiency: the Cicatrix Maledictum, the massive warp storm that split the Imperium and redefined galactic geography in an instant, spewed enormous quantities of chaos energy into real space, corrupting worlds and drowning significant portions of the galaxy in warp-influenced madness. This was a problem for the Tyranids specifically because the raw matter of chaos is indigestible. Daemons, warp stuff, corrupted biomass. None of it can be consumed and processed by the Norn Queen's genetic machinery. The Great Rift effectively quarantined vast quantities of potential biomass, placing it behind a barrier of warp, fire that the hive mind could not simply eat its way through. The hive mind's response to this was Hive Fleet Kronos, where other hive fleets are generalists, adapted for consuming everything in their path with maximum efficiency. Kronos is a specialist, a fleet specifically evolved to fight the forces of chaos, to clear warp-corrupted worlds of daemonic infestation, and to close or suppress warp rifts through the application of a massively amplified shadow in the warp. Kronos does not charge into melee. It stands at range and unleashes a storm of biological projectiles, while its psychic shadow presses down on any warp, active entities in the area, weakening them, disrupting their connection to the warp, and ultimately forcing daemons back into the immaterium they came from. This is profoundly significant in what it reveals about the hive mind's thinking. Hive Fleet Kronos is not simply an adaptation to a difficult environment. It is a deliberate long-term strategy. The hive mind has recognized that the chaos corruption spreading from the Great Rift poses a structural threat to the galaxy's value as a feeding ground. If enough of the galaxy becomes warp-saturated, if enough worlds are corrupted beyond biological usability, the entire resource base that the hive fleets came here to consume is degraded. So Kronos exists to sanitize, to preserve the galaxy's biomass for eventual consumption by clearing out the chaos contamination first. It is the hive mind performing the equivalent of protecting a pantry from mold, not because it cares about the mold, but because it cares about the food. There is also the sobering matter of the sheer number of hive fleets that have been identified. The three major ones, Behemoth Kraken, Leviathan, received the most attention because they were the most destructive and the most directly threatening to the core Imperium. But the official lexicon of identified hive fleets now numbers in the dozens. Gorgon Hydra, Jormungandr Kronos, Tiamat, Ouroboros, Typhon, Naga Chimera, Laden. The list extends far beyond casual recognition. Each of these represents a separate incursion, a separate mass of biological material that crossed the intergalactic void and began consuming. And most of them are not fully destroyed. They are broken, fragmented, their main bodies shattered in military engagements, but their surviving splinter fleets continue to move through the galaxy, feeding and growing and reconnecting with the broader hive mind. A splinter fleet that loses a battle simply dissolves into the background noise of the galaxy and keeps eating smaller, less defended targets, slowly recovering its strength. The picture that emerges from taking all of this together is deeply uncomfortable. The Milky Way is experiencing an invasion that has been in preparation for 10,000 years, conducted by a species that existed and was consuming galaxies before humanity was born. Drawn here by a chain of events that began with a heroic sacrifice in the middle of a civil war, sustained by the light of the galaxy's greatest protector, and currently entering a phase that the Ordo Xenos believes is still only the beginning of the main assault. The real reason they are here: hunger, accident, and the irony of light. Now we arrive at the question the title promised. The real reason the Tyranids are here, and the answer, like most genuinely interesting answers, has several layers. The surface answer is hunger. The Tyranids are here because they need biomass. They have always needed biomass, and they have always moved toward it. This galaxy is a galaxy full of life, 100,000 inhabited worlds, countless billions of organisms on each one, millennia of biological diversity and evolutionary richness. From a purely nutritional standpoint, the Milky Way is an extraordinarily well-stocked pantry. The Tyranids are here for the same reason wolves follow deer migration patterns. Because this is where the food is. That answer is true as far as it goes, but it does not fully address the question of why here and why now. The second layer of the answer is the pharaohs. The Tyranids were not inevitably going to find the Milky Way. The intergalactic void is vast, and there are many galaxies in the local group. The precise moment when the hive fleets oriented toward this particular galaxy, when the hive mind turned its distributed attention in this direction and began the long approach, was the moment when the Pharaohs was overloaded during the Battle of Sotha. That event, some 10,000 years before the first hive fleet arrived, was the trigger. Before that, the Tyranids were either drifting in metabolic suspension between galaxies, or they were oriented toward a different destination, or they simply had not detected the Milky Way strongly enough to prioritize it. The story of the Pharaohs is a story about unintended consequences of stunning scale. Barabbas d'Antioch saved the Imperium Secundus and preserved the Loyalist cause during the most desperate period of the Horus heresy, and in doing so, created the chain of events that would lead to the gravest existential threat humanity has ever faced. There is no blame in this. There is only the vast, impersonal machinery of cause and effect operating at a scale that makes human intention almost meaninglessly small. D'Antioch could not have known. Nobody could have known. The Tyranids were out there in the dark, and the dark was silent, and the galaxy had no reason to suspect that anything was listening. The third layer is the Astronomicon. Once the Pharaohs gave the hive fleets their initial orientation, the Astronomicon took over as the primary beacon. The Emperor, sustaining the light that holds the Imperium together, was simultaneously and unavoidably marking it as the target. This creates the extraordinary tragic irony at the heart of the Tyranid invasion. The most important thing the Emperor does, the thing that makes human civilization in the 41st millennium possible, is the thing that tells the galaxy's greatest predator exactly where to look. Every warp jump, every supply convoy, every act of communication that passes through the Astronomicon's light is made possible by a beacon that also functions as an advertisement of humanity's existence and location to the Tyranid hive mind. There is a beautiful and terrible philosophical echo here to the Fermi paradox, the old question from pre-spaceflight human science that asks, if intelligent life is likely to exist throughout the universe, why have we not detected any signals from it? One of the proposed answers, historically, was that broadcasting your existence is dangerous. That advanced civilizations go silent precisely because the universe contains things that come when called. In the lore of Warhammer 40K, the Imperium cannot go silent. It needs the Astronomicon too desperately to consider dimming it, and so it continues to burn, and the Tyranids continue to come, and the galaxy continues to fight. The fourth layer, perhaps the most haunting, is the question of what else might be coming. The hive fleets in the galaxy now are not the full species. They are advanced elements, probes, the earliest arrivals of an invasion that began with a single overloaded psychic device and has been building momentum for 10 millennia. The main body of the Tyranid race is still out there. Some of it may be in the intergalactic void. Some of it may still be consuming whatever galaxies were its most recent feeding grounds before the Milky Way caught its attention. The scale of what is coming, if the scholars of the Ordo Xenos are correct, dwarfs everything that has arrived so far. Think about what we know. Hive Fleet Leviathan, the largest individual fleet encountered, was still only a portion of the overall Tyranid force. The hive fleets are approaching from different directions, which means they originated from different starting points, different sectors of space, possibly different consumed galaxies, and are converging on the Milky Way from multiple vectors. The structure being built on Zia Foria by Hive Fleet Tiamat appears to be signaling further into the intergalactic void. The hive mind, which operates across distances that make individual planetary invasions look like rounding errors, is coordinating this convergence on a timescale that human history cannot fully comprehend. The most extreme interpretation of the available evidence, expressed in classified Ordo Xenos documents and in the privately recorded thoughts of certain very senior figures in the Inquisition, is this: the Milky Way galaxy has been targeted. Not accidentally, not incidentally, but targeted. The furrows may have been the original signal, and the Astronomicon may have confirmed the target. But the convergence of multiple hive fleets from multiple directions suggests something beyond simple orientation toward a food source. It suggests that the hive mind has made a decision, at the species level, that the Milky Way is the next major feeding ground, and that the resources necessary to consume it entirely are being marshaled. The fleets already here are the scouts, the probes, the advance force that weakens the target's defenses and tests its resistance. The main event has not started yet. Now consider one final piece. The hive mind remembers everything. Every hive fleet that has been defeated, every world that has been defended successfully, every weapon developed specifically to counter Tyranid bioforms, every tactic that slowed or stopped a Tyranid advance, all of it has been observed, catalogued, and fed back into the genetic archive. The hive fleets now operating in the galaxy are already incorporating lessons learned from Behemoth's defeat at Makraj and Kraken's defeat at Echer and Leviathan's disruption at Bile. The next wave will be more sophisticated than everything that has come before, because the hive mind is patient, it is thorough, and it has been doing this by all available evidence. For a very long time, the irony of ironies, the final terrible loop in this story, is that every defender who has thrown themselves against a Tyranid invasion, and one has, in winning, also educated the enemy about how to overcome them next time. The heroism of the Ultramarines at Makraig was genuine, the sacrifice of the Blood Angels at Bol was genuine, the desperate ingenuity of Marnius Calgar and his chapter was genuine. None of it was wasted. All of it saved lives and bought time, and all of it was also observed, recorded, and processed by a mind so vast that 10,000 years of waiting barely registered as impatience. The Tyranids are here, because a dying man on a forgotten planet, in the middle of a galaxy's worst civil war, reached for the closest tool available, and used it to save the people he cared about. They are here because the Emperor of Mankind, fighting for his people's survival across 10,000 years, continues to burn as the greatest beacon in the galaxy. They are here because galaxies full of life are genuinely, objectively, a better food source than the darkness between them, and the Great Devourer is nothing if not practical about food. And they are here because the Milky Way, for all its wars and its suffering and its grimness, is rich with life, teeming with organisms of extraordinary biological complexity, and that complexity, to a species that measures wealth in genetic diversity, is the most valuable thing in the universe. Every living thing in the Milky Way is, in the final accounting of Tyranid logic, food. Every civilization that has ever risen and fallen in this galaxy has produced biological material of value to the hive mind. Every conflict, every war, every act of survival, all of it, in the cold arithmetic of the Great Devourer, is just the biomass organizing itself for a while before it is consumed. The galaxy's response, and why it is not enough the civilizations of the Milky Way have not accepted this fate passively. The Imperium of man, for all its dysfunction and brutality and institutional rot, has fought the tyrannic wars with a ferocity and a sacrifice that would be awe-inspiring if the scale of the threat were not so overwhelming. Individual space marines have thrown themselves against organisms 50 times their size. Naval captains have rammed their ships into hive fleets at full speed. Entire planetary populations have fought until the last organism of their world, human or animal, was consumed. The record of the tyrannic wars is a record of stunning, grinding, terrible heroism. But heroism is not a counter-strategy. The Imperium's military doctrine for dealing with Tyranids has evolved significantly since Behemoth, incorporating hard-won lessons from 3 major wars and a constant series of smaller engagements. The Death Watch, a kill team organization staffed by members of different Space Marine chapters, specifically tasked with Xenos hunting, has developed anti-Tyranid techniques, identifying optimal kill priorities, understanding the synapse network and the value of disrupting it, learning which bioforms pose existential threats versus which can be managed tactically. The Magos biologists of the Adeptus Mechanicus have worked to understand the biology of Tyranid organisms, looking for vulnerabilities that can be exploited, genetic weaknesses that might be weaponized. Inquisitors of the Ordo Xenos have spent careers mapping the spread of genestealer infestations and developing protocols for their detection and elimination. None of it has stopped the invasion. It has slowed portions of it. It has saved individual worlds and systems. It has, arguably, given the galaxy more time. But the Tyranids keep coming, and the hive mind keeps learning, and the gap between the quality of Tyranid adaptation and the quality of available defenses has not consistently widened in humanity's favor. Other major factions have had their own encounters with the Tyranids, and the results have uniformly been instructive about the scale of the problem. The Tau Empire, confident in their technology and their adaptability, faced Hive Fleet Gorgon with everything they had, and came very close to annihilation despite being militarily successful in the end. The encounter left portions of Tau space as dead zones called the Zone of Silence, and fundamentally changed the Tau's strategic priorities for generations afterward. The Eldari, with all their foresight and their ancient wisdom, nearly lost Craftworld Iondan. The Necrons, who provide no biomass to the Tyranids and are therefore largely ignored by the hive mind, have watched the invasion with what passes for concern among beings who predate galactic civilization, and have begun making strategic calculations that the other races of the galaxy are not yet aware of. What is perhaps most honest about the Tyranid lore is that it does not offer easy reassurance. Warhammer 40 Zarozan is a setting defined by grimdark honesty about the nature of war and survival, and the Tyranids represent perhaps the clearest expression of that honesty. They are not a villain with a plan that can be disrupted, not an evil god whose power can be weakened, not a civilization that can be negotiated with or whose social structure contains inherent fracture points. They are an ecosystem with a directive, and the directive is absolute. The only thing that stands between that directive and its completion is the will of every living thing in the galaxy to fight, and keep fighting even when the math says fighting is meaningless. That is not nothing. In the context of the setting, it is everything. The heroism that the Tyranid invasion calls forth, the desperate alliances and the impossible stands, and the moments when individuals or chapters or entire worlds hold the line against something that should be unstoppable. All of it matters. Every world defended is a world that its inhabitants got to keep. Every generation bought by costly sacrifice is a generation that gets to exist. The Tyranids operate on timescales so vast that every delay, every setback, every successful defense represents billions of lives that were lived, loved, and experienced in full rather than being consumed. But the invasion does not stop. The hive mind does not mourn its losses. The Norn Queens process the biomass of whatever was destroyed in the last battle and produce more, better, improved. The fleet advances. The shadow in the warp falls on new systems, and somewhere in the intergalactic dark, the rest of the species, the portion that hasn't arrived yet, continues its long, patient, terrifying approach. The scale of what is coming let us end with a thought that properly captures the scope of what the Tyranid invasion represents within the context of Warhammer 40,000. The Milky Way galaxy contains somewhere in the region of 400 billion stars. A significant fraction of those stars host planets with some form of life. The Imperium of Maine, covering roughly 1 million inhabited worlds, is itself only a small fraction of the life-bearing planets in the galaxy. Add the worlds of the Eldar, the Tor, the Orcs, the Necrons, the countless minor Xenos races and uninhabited but life-bearing worlds, and the total biological wealth of the Milky Way is almost impossibly large. The Tyranids, over the course of the 3 major Tyrannic wars and the numerous smaller incursions, have consumed a small fraction of that wealth. They have stripped worlds, incorporated genetic material, grown larger and more sophisticated, and they are still coming. The main body of the species has not yet arrived. What the Tyranids represent at their philosophical core is the universe's reminder that existence is not guaranteed, that the scale of the cosmos means the scale of possible threats is correspondingly vast, that a civilization, even 1,000 civilizations, can do everything right, can fight with everything they have, can sacrifice beyond measure, and still face a threat whose sheer momentum is difficult to stop simply through the application of will and heroism. And yet, the Imperium of Man has survived. Craftworld Iondan survived. The Tau Empire survived. The galaxy continues to resist, continues to fight, continues to refuse the consummation that the hive mind intends for it. Every battle that is won, every genestealer cult that is uncovered and destroyed before the fleet arrives, every Norn, queen killed in her hive ship, every swarmlord beaten back, all of it matters. Not because it will ultimately stop the Tyranids, not in any final, clean sense, but because in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the meaning is not in the outcome. It is in the choice to fight regardless of the outcome. The real reason the Tyranids are here is accidental, cosmic, and deeply human. A man made a heroic sacrifice, and the shockwave of it traveled further than he could ever imagine. A galaxy lit up its heart to find its way through the dark, and something in the darkness heard the light and came looking. The universe, indifferent to the hopes and fears of anything small enough to live within it, simply followed the logic of cause and effect to its natural conclusion. And now everything that lives in the Milky Way must face that conclusion together, or not survive. If this video gave you something to think about, if the lore of the Great Devourer hit different after spending an hour with it, please hit the like button and drop a comment down below. Tell me your favorite hive fleet. Tell me which piece of Tyranid lore keeps you up at night. Tell me which part of this enormous story you want to explore next. This channel exists because of people who want to sink deep into the lore of Warhammer 40,000 and actually understand what makes it so extraordinary. Your support, your comments, your subscriptions, they are what keeps this going. If you have not subscribed yet, please do. Hit the bell so you never miss a new video. We do deep dives like this regularly, and the next one is going to be just as thorough, just as atmospheric, and just as long. This is Q on 40K. The darkness is patient, so are we.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.